Welcome back. In this final video on data types, I'm going to talk about arrays. I began by creating a standard variable called names. This is just a normal variable, and it happens to be holding an array. Oftentimes when you read tutorials or watch them, you'll hear people refer to the variable that happens to hold an array as the array itself. So they will tell you to do this or that to some kind of an array, and they're usually referring to this variable. And that's fine most of the time, but just keep in mind that this is just a variable and this is an array. They are two separate things. The variable happens to hold the array. Now, an array, if you're not familiar with them, is really just a way to group multiple pieces of data together and store them together and work with them together. So rather than creating three separate variables for three separate names, we can put the three names inside of an array and store that array in a variable. So how do we add data to the array? We put the values inside of quotes, and then we separate each one with a comma. And you can pretty much have arrays of any length. You're pretty much limited by the amount of memory on your computer or available to you on your server. So here I've added three names to this array. Again, instead of using three separate variables, I've put them inside of this array, and now they're stored in this variable called names. With a normal variable, we would just say print. Watch what happens when I print this out. It displays the word array, because it's telling us that's what the variable contains. It's printing out what is inside of that variable, and that happens to be an array. But what if we want to access the individual values of the array? We have to use square brackets on the end of the variable. They are connected to the variables. There's no spaces or anything like that. You just put the square brackets directly on the end of the variable, and inside of those square brackets you can type a number. By default, PHP starts counting at 0 with the first element of the array. So the first piece of data in this, or this first element, becomes 0. Sally becomes 1, and Bob becomes 2. So 0, 1, 2. So if I want to print my name out, I would say print names. Inside of square brackets, I'd put 0. Because this is the 0 element. And we now see my name being displayed on the screen. If you wanted to print Bob, you would see this goes 0, 1, 2. So we put 2 in there, and we should see Bob being displayed on the screen. And of course we do. So that's pretty simple. Now there is another way to create an array. I'm going to comment that out. Let's clear the screen here, refresh it. Nothing's being printed because the variable names actually doesn't exist yet because it's commented out. So we're going to create it again. And we're going to use the square brackets directly on the end, just like when we're printing it. And we can work with it just like any other variable. Just like we do with any standard variable. I can now say Zach Sally and Bob. So this here is equivalent to what I just had up here. There really is no difference. I really like using this style. It's really just a style difference when I'm working with short arrays. If I'm assigning something to an array. Usually I'll do this if I've got long lists of stuff, just because it can be all included in a single line of code. So I can make one really long line of code with a whole bunch of values. But when readability is important, or you've got a small list, I really like this syntax. Usually if you're creating something and you're going to write some settings, maybe you're going to store information like your username and password and host name for a database. Oops. You store all of that maybe in an array. This syntax works really well because it allows you to easily see your data. Remember, it starts counting at 0, so this becomes the 0 element, and you can put those in there if you want. I mean, you're not really changing anything because by default they have this value. And we're seeing Bob being printed to the screen because I said print element 2, which happens to be the third one. Because in many C derivatives or C languages, counting starts at 0. But we're not limited to just using numbers. We can also use strings. So I can say my name and her name. I'll leave Bob blank for right now. So if I want to print out my name, I would say my name. I'm using the value that I gave to this element, the name that I gave to it, inside of here. By default, again, it would normally be 0 if left blank, but because I overrode the default with a value, this now becomes the element name or the index name, and I can use that down here to access this value. And we're seeing Zach being printed to the screen now. Now, because I didn't use a number up here, PHP starts counting at the first number that's used. Because I didn't use a number up here, an integer, Bob now gets the default value of 0. So if I say print 0, I will now see Bob. And of course we see Bob. If I would have used a number up here, let's say I put 1 here. I overrode the default. I started the counter basically at 1. I overrode this default value. So PHP does nothing with this. But it begins counting again right here. Well, because I used 1 up here, it now makes Bob 2. So I should still see Bob on the screen. And nothing is changing. Now, just so we can see that it does change, if we go back to 1, we see Zach. 2, we'll see Bob. So that's pretty much it. There's really not much to creating an array, but there is a lot to working with them. There are built-in functions to the language for sorting an array in alphabetical order. There are many functions built into the language for all kinds of things, and you're going to use them all the time in programming, so you want to become familiar with them. I promise you will use them daily in programming for something. And if you're not, well, then you're probably doing things the hard way most of the time. So just become familiar with arrays.